Well, thank you very much, Brian, and it's a great pleasure and indeed a privilege and an honour to be here and to see the next chapter in this wonderful story develop of creating a genuine infrastructure community of experts to help inform and direct what might be a better infrastructure future for our nations, wherever that may be. In fact, it was just 12 months ago to this day that the inaugural event of this symposium series was launched in Sydney and then in Wollongong the following day. And the vision at the time, and it certainly hasn't changed, was one that was grounded in some very practical considerations. As I was charged with the task of creating a national infrastructure research laboratory in Australia, it became apparent very quickly that the number of academics within Australia and indeed around the world that had the requisite skills to be able to operate in a highly interdisciplinary environment that is demanded of infrastructure systems investigations was simply not there. The intervention to help address that was clear in my mind, and that was to create a global network of like-minded institutions and people to come together to address these issues and to create and to recruit particularly a cohort of young researchers that can take this forward. And this is very much the first and foremost consideration, I think, in the ISNGI community. That is to create a critical mass of people that can come together to research in an interdisciplinary way the very big questions associated with infrastructure systems analysis, and so that we can help each other, and help we are starting to do, whether it's through collaborations with UCL or with Jim's group at the ITRC, all of which are starting to create some very practical and also some very strong bonds between us as we go forward in creating a community. And I think the second part of the vision for this, and Brian and I had shopped this around considerably, was that around the world, the quality of the infrastructure discourse, the quality of the infrastructure dialogue was indeed lacking. Much of the infrastructure discussion, much of the infrastructure decisions, particularly in the Western world, were taken on a thread of evidence, and I think that in some ways is an overstatement. And it lacked both proper and rigorous dialogue, and it was certainly not enriched by data, and it certainly wasn't enriched by emerging conceptual frameworks about what infrastructure systems may or could achieve. In some ways, it was the magic. The politicians often refer to look at infrastructure, and Australia has been certainly embraced by just about every politician in the last 15 years. I think the magic is not so much in the infrastructure as it's in the votes, because when one is associated with infrastructure, one is seen as being virtuous, and when one is virtuous, politicians try to hang on to that at a very keen rate. But importantly, this dialogue needs to also be very conscious of the fact that the academic community needs to be enriched and empowered by the broader community of policymakers, the broader community of business people as well, and the community itself, because they're the ones that deal with the infrastructure system that we are trying to investigate day in and day out. And they actually don't look at it as individual silos. They don't look at infrastructure as just water or just energy or just transportation. When they get up in the morning and they turn on a light switch or they need to make the journey to work, they look at it as a system, and they have an expectation. And that expectation is that the system must work seamlessly. It must be able to deliver them to where they need to go or what their businesses need to do. And in some ways, that is still very much a missing ingredient from any deliberations in this domain as to what is an infrastructure system and how can we improve on it. So the big task of this symposia series, as was the case last year in Australia and is the case now in Vienna, and certainly I think will be the case in the United States next year with Virginia Tech, and then subsequently in 2016 in Asia, is to remain close to the grand research challenge that has been well stated by UCL and also the University of Wollongong last year. And I'll come back to that grand research challenge a little bit later. But as I said last year in my opening address to the ISNGI, we must seek to enable better knowledge exchange and community building amongst the eclectic groups of experts that are concerned with long-term planning of cities, regional areas and national infrastructure systems. There's just simply no doubt that there's been significant research advancement and scholarship in the individual academic disciplines, but also there has been advancement in the functional areas like water, energy, transport, telecommunications and social infrastructure. A big tick to everybody. But I believe that our aim is higher than that and grander than that, and that we must seek to transfer that domain-specific knowledge into a broader system perspective. So put another way, our task in infrastructure research and policy development is to break down the traditional silos of academia and the functional silos of government and business to take a more holistic approach. And I think Brian once described it as we need to take a 40,000-foot perspective, and our job is to create the floodlights, to open up so that we can see the patterns, we can see the movement of people and goods and so forth across the grand networks that exist within the infrastructure system. And that's really where we must keep our focus. And why is that important? It's important because the community demands a seamless infrastructure system, because that's exactly how they use it. There is no mistaking it, that the language of physics, engineering, chemistry, economics, sociology and psychology, and so the list goes on, all come together when it comes to matters of infrastructure, because infrastructure is personal. Personal in the sense that it's absolutely fundamental to your quality of life and to the quality of life of institutions as well, and that the task before us to make the infrastructure work better and to be more synergistic is one that we are at a very early stage of development. But that development will come from this group, I believe. So we're slowly educating ourselves on these biophysical relationships, the way electrons and so forth move around networks and so forth, and we must improve that understanding and understand the interdependencies that exist across the infrastructure system so that it can accommodate the very grand challenges that exist in accommodating an older population, a bigger population, and indeed a more dense population. But of course, beyond the physical infrastructure is the behaviour of people, which has been mentioned appropriately by Brian. And those people usually come in the form of users and sometimes customers. In fact, the word customer rarely shows up in an infrastructure discussion. It's usually a user. And it's important that there is an emerging area of research here to better understand the way behaviour within infrastructure can play a more central role in understanding the solutions going forward. It's very apparent that human beings collectively like to use infrastructure all at the same time. This poses considerable challenges such as providing capacity in the peak period while the system is relatively idle for the rest of the year or even the rest of the day. Building more roads and railway systems in order to meet the peak hour is simply got clear limitations. There is limited time and there is limited space. Shifting behaviour, shifting people and activity and demand to the shoulder is absolutely critical. And it couldn't be truer that in terms of finding better and smarter infrastructure solutions needs to look at the system of why we have peak hours in the first place. Is it because of school hours? Is it because of retail operating hours? Is it because of the existence of penalty rates in the after hours? Or is it simply that it's too hard for people to change their location of where they live when their jobs change, putting even greater emphasis on the need for a transport system? There are many non-capital interventions that can be made in order to make our systems work, but yet these are systematically overlooked. So that's why we need unifying research themes that force a holistic approach to infrastructure problem solving. So when I see themes like sustainability, resilience, productivity, livability, all of them are good themes because they demand a multidisciplinary perspective. There is no individual body of knowledge out there that will solve these problems in themselves. And I commend Brian for sort of emphasising particularly the role of resilience and sustainability as part of a theme for the European discussion. So turning now to the impact on Australia. Well, having a meeting may not in itself deliver an impact. I think we need to be realistic towards that. And in fact, that's why the ISNGI is so important, that we create a continuity of conversation that occurs from one year to the next across the globe to ensure that we build on each other in order to create the body of knowledge. Because at some point there will be a tipping point where that knowledge is so compelling that it will have an impact. So in terms of the expectations as to whether the ISNGI in fact was transformative to Australia, I'm afraid that I can't actually inform you of that. But from another perspective, Australia is a nation that has proven itself to be adaptable to the challenges of growth and prosperity. And with that, there has been a good measure of good luck as well. The role of infrastructure is a very central part of the public discourse for politicians, as been referred to earlier. And in fact, our own new Prime Minister in Australia, Tony Abbott, describes himself as wanting to be remembered as the Infrastructure Prime Minister. And there is no sign of abatement of the near endless surge of infrastructure spending in Australia and the infinite rhetoric that sits around infrastructure. So importantly, in Australia, we have to create a more balanced debate, and the ISNGI has made a serious contribution in doing so. And that is where SMART comes in as well, as to be more balanced and to not join the throngs of saying more infrastructure is just better. And in fact, that more balanced debate, where the status quo of infrastructure is being questioned, was brought out very well by the Australian Productivity Commission on Infrastructure Costs and Investment that was released just a couple of months ago. This is a state-of-the-art critique of infrastructure analysis in Australia, and much of the discussion is applicable to just about any other Western world. If you have not had a chance to review it, I commend it to you and can give you the coordinates to read it. It's rich in research questions, and it makes the point very ably that some of the biggest challenges to proper infrastructure research is the availability of data. The amount of data that is available to understand what has happened in the past with infrastructure and where we are going in the future is simply not there. So I commend the report to you, and I also commend to you the communique that was prepared for the 2013 ISNGI, which is available on the SMART website. It's a comprehensive document that sets out the key conclusions of the 5 days of proceedings. This has been an important document in Australia, and it has certainly had some influence. And I would encourage the organisers for this event to also produce a similar communique. We need a track record of what we're discussing and where we're going so that the hosts in the United States can build on that going forward, and I'm sure that that will happen. One of the key impacts, though, I think, of the 2013 ISNGI was the recognition that infrastructure can only be approached in a multidisciplinary environment. And we are continuing the discussion. In fact, only in August of this year, we held the second SMART Business and Policy Dialogue that addressed some of the themes that are concerned with policymakers and the process of decision-making around infrastructure. The outcomes of that communique are also available on our website. That was concerned with delivering better value for money for infrastructure for taxpayers. And it's been amazing, just the amount of take-up across the board of the word better value for money for infrastructure, because as part of the magic criteria, you just spend what is demanded. It's a blank check. And in Australia, our infrastructure costs have just become out of control. And we're finding that the return of that infrastructure investment is indeed not matched by the size of the dollars that have been directed towards it. We will continue this dialogue with the broader community next year, where we plan to have an infrastructure dialogue with long-term investors, particularly with sovereign wealth funds, pension funds and superannuation funds in this area. They are important to this group because there are very few groups within the institutional community that think about infrastructure from a network perspective. And all these funds which have positions or investments which go for 30 to 50 years are interested in the network because it's where the network will deliver the value of the asset to them in 30 to 40 years' time. And they need to be a player in that network. And there is a great deal of learning, there's a great deal of methodology that can be extracted from these folks in order to inform academic research. And I commend you to sort of take a closer look at them because they are very sophisticated, and I would put to you probably several steps ahead of the academic community in this regard at the moment. One of the other important outcomes which is related in the context of the ISNGI is that Australia is chairing and hosting the G20 this year. And the Australian Prime Minister and the Federal Treasurer have announced as part of the G20 that Australia will be hosting an infrastructure knowledge hub. And this will be one of the key outcomes of the heads of state that will be meeting in Brisbane in November as part of the G20, will be to launch this infrastructure knowledge hub. And the purpose of that is to identify better practice and to share case material, data and procurement methodologies in order to set higher standards and outcomes for infrastructure investment. This, I think, is an area which the ISNGI must take a very close look because there is not only money attached to this activity, but there's also a backbone or a network in order to create the proper knowledge exchange that is needed. Because much of this knowledge is not open to the community. It's tied up inside departments of state that require the cooperation at the senior levels of government to get access to it. Another significant development that occurred as a result of the ISNGI was that SMART released a green paper on infrastructure imperatives for Australia in February of this year. And it set up a framework that has been embraced by both federal and state governments, and indeed a number of international governments, I should add, in looking at planning and best practice for infrastructure through to the 22nd century. The Green Paper was inspired by the ISNGI in 2013, makes 18 recommendations towards best practice in infrastructure delivery. And in there are a range of recommendations which could be helpful to forming your own research agenda. There has been a clear acceptance in Australia that our work is simply not concerned with trying to predict the future and to form elegant but potentially irrelevant solutions to such an end. Instead, we seek to ensure that the right building blocks for growth are in place so Australia can adapt and thrive to whatever circumstances the future may throw at us. To that end, we in Australia and the rest of the world have much to do. While the task is large, we have the benefit of an improved institutional structure, along with a nascent research program that will really have to prove itself, but at the same time, we need to provide the necessary scaffolding to assist policymakers, in particular, to do better. And I see that in 4 ways. The first is probably the most important, that groups such as this that are non-aligned and that are independent need to ask the right questions about infrastructure. The what, the where and the when are very important. We also need to bring an independent evidence-based arguments that have been missing for too long to help correct a deep bias in infrastructure. And that deep bias is just simply this, that big, large, mega, shiny infrastructure projects are better. This has come at a huge cost, I believe, to the Western world. That the Western world actually would be far better served by incremental improvements to the existing infrastructure, investment in the betterment of existing infrastructure before rushing headstrong into so-called greenfield mega projects. This has been a deep bias that is existing in the Western world and it is doing us a great deal of harm. We also need to bring a deeper connection to infrastructure of the role of interdependent populations, demographic trends and land use planning. You simply can't have good infrastructure unless you have efficient land use. The two are intimately connected, but yet infrastructure is seen as a silo from land use planning in so many countries, including my own. And the fourth is to ensure transparency of decisions so that the community can build up confidence in the project and where government and industry supporting infrastructure are held to account for the proper allocation of a state's scarce financial resources. So I think it's fair to say that this community, an intellectual community, are we doing enough to support better long-term infrastructure planning? And to that point, I'd like to sort of challenge you to say that we actually have to move from just meeting and talking and to create a global infrastructure data hub. Now, what goes into that data hub should be a matter of consultation with you, the community. But let me put 3 suggestions forward to you. That we need a global infrastructure data hub to better evaluate why infrastructure costs what it does and how we can extract greater value for money. We also need to have a much better understanding of the mysteries of consumption of infrastructure, particularly in terms of utility consumption, energy, water, and so forth. There is a great debate about how do we invest in the next 50 to 100 years and understanding what is the nature of infrastructure consumption. The rate of consumption of infrastructure in the next 100 years, I would argue, my hypothesis is that it will be a fraction of what it has been compared to the last 100 years. The reason for that is simply that there is some fundamental changes afoot in the way consumers are consuming infrastructure. They are more efficient, they are technologically savvy, and they are certainly less reliant on centrally organised infrastructure systems. And the third area is innovation in infrastructure. Infrastructure has been rated by the Global McKinsey Institute as being one of the great laggards in innovation. Why is that the case and what can be done about it? And I could think of no better group to analyse and to understand what is the role of innovation in meeting our grand research challenge. So we must be prepared to ask the difficult questions about infrastructure, to question the behaviours in infrastructure where the presumption that more is better. Perhaps we have to do more with less, but my heart is actually much more radical than that. We have to do less with less in order to be efficient going forward. So in conclusion, I think all the delegates to this symposium, both this year and last, I'm sure are clearly committed to improving our individual and collective ability to undertake better infrastructure planning and development. Yet we continue to be challenged by the modesty of conceptual frameworks, data, analytical tools and research to support these undertakings. The societies in which we live, however, cannot wait for a new infrastructure science to emerge that will deliver the so-called silver bullet solutions. The possibilities of developing an infrastructure science can only be realised from the process of doing. That is planning, designing, procuring, investing, constructing, renovating, innovating infrastructure. However, having in place the ability to record those experiences and to capture the lessons and to have a proper institutional structure that can analyse those experiences is where we must be, because in the absence of that, our capacity to create any science around infrastructure will be fundamentally compromised. So in conclusion, I'd like to particularly commend Brian and the UCL team for bringing about this symposium. The program is inspiring. I'd also like to acknowledge the co-host partners, the University of Oxford and Delft, in contributing significantly to that program as well. And I wish you all great learnings here in Vienna, and then onwards to our US program in 2015, which will be hosted in Washington, DC by Virginia Tech, which I think promises to be both an exciting and invigorating event for each of us to contribute to. So as a final word, let us remain close to the grand challenge of the symposium that lies before us and binds us together as a research community. And I won't quote all of the grand challenge, but given that infrastructure is not an engineering artefact, but an agent of change, is it possible to imagine infrastructure systems that can meet the needs of twice today's population with half today's resources while providing twice the livability? The factor 8 is indeed a profound challenge, but one that we are capable of doing. The ISNGI community of experts is an important piece of the jigsaw for a more learned and professional global infrastructure community. I wish each of you a very productive and purposeful time here at the 2014 ISNGI, Vienna, Austria. Thank you.